On April 26, 1986, reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant exploded during a late-night safety test in northern Ukraine. The blast tore open the reactor core, ignited a graphite fire, and released vast quantities of radioactive material into the atmosphere. Within hours, invisible radioactive particles were drifting far beyond the power plant itself. Carried by wind and weather, they spread across Ukraine, Belarus, Russia, and large parts of Europe. Among the many ways this radiation entered the human body, one stood out for its speed, reach, and long-term consequences: milk. In the days immediately following the explosion, radioactive fallout settled onto fields and grasslands across some of the most heavily farmed regions in Eastern Europe. Cows grazing on contaminated pasture consumed radioactive material directly. What made this especially dangerous was the presence of iodine-131. Iodine-131 is a radioactive isotope produced during nuclear fission. It has a short half-life of about 8 days, but it poses a serious risk because of how the human body handles iodine. When iodine is consumed, the body concentrates it in the thyroid gland, a small organ in the neck that regulates metabolism and growth. When iodine-131 entered the food chain, milk became the fastest and most efficient delivery system. In 1986, milk was a daily staple across rural Ukraine and Belarus. It was often consumed fresh, locally sourced, and unprocessed. As cows ate contaminated grass, iodine-131 passed into their milk within hours. Families drank it without any warning. Children drank the most. By the time authorities began restricting milk consumption in affected regions, widespread exposure had already occurred. In the years that followed, scientists documented a clear and consistent pattern. Children who consumed contaminated milk after the Chernobyl explosion received significantly higher radiation doses to their thyroid glands. Beginning in the early 1990s, cases of thyroid cancer among children and adolescents increased sharply in Ukraine, Belarus, and parts of Russia. This link between iodine-131 exposure through milk and thyroid cancer is now one of the most firmly established health effects of the Chernobyl disaster. As time passed, iodine-131 decayed away. But the danger did not disappear. Other radioactive isotopes remained in the environment, particularly cesium-137 and strontium-90. Cesium-137 has a half-life of about 30 years and behaves like potassium in the body. Strontium-90 has a similar half-life and mimics calcium, allowing it to accumulate in bones and teeth. Unlike iodine-131, these isotopes persist in soil for decades. That persistence meant that milk could remain contaminated long after the initial explosion. Nowhere was this more evident than in Belarus. Although Chernobyl is located in Ukraine, Belarus received an estimated 70% of the radioactive fallout. Large agricultural areas were affected. Despite this, dairy farming continued near the edges of contaminated zones. Nearly 30 years after the explosion, journalists from the Associated Press visited farms just kilometers from areas still officially restricted for permanent human habitation. At one such farm, a glass of freshly drawn milk was offered to visitors. The milk was tested in a laboratory. The results were striking. The analysis showed that the milk contained strontium-90 at levels 10 times higher than Belarusian food safety limits. Belarusian regulations allow no more than 3.7 becquerels per kilogram of strontium-90 in food. The tested milk contained 37.5 becquerels per kilogram. Strontium-90 is particularly dangerous because it behaves like calcium in the human body. When consumed repeatedly, it becomes embedded in bones, where it can irradiate bone marrow and increase the risk of cancer and cardiovascular disease. Health experts emphasize that the risk lies not in a single glass of milk, but in long-term, repeated consumption. Despite the laboratory findings, the dairy processor receiving the milk rejected the results. Company officials insisted their own testing showed radiation levels well within safety limits. In Belarus, food producers are largely responsible for monitoring their own products. Independent oversight is limited. State laboratories lack the equipment to detect some of the heavier radioactive isotopes that may still be present in contaminated soil. Radiobiologists warn that radiation exposure through food is cumulative. Small amounts consumed regularly can build up in the body over time. This accumulation increases long-term health risks. The World Health Organization has repeatedly stated that contaminated food remains one of the most significant pathways for radiation exposure following nuclear accidents. Milk is especially important because of how frequently it is consumed and because it is a major source of nutrition for children. Or, in some regions after Chernobyl, contaminated milk was destroyed. In others, it was diluted. Milk from contaminated farms was mixed with cleaner supplies to reduce measured radiation levels. While this practice could bring products below legal limits, it did not eliminate exposure entirely. Environmental groups and food industry workers have reported that this mixing was common and rarely punished. As a result, radiation continued to enter the food chain quietly and legally. Decades after the explosion, radioactive contamination still lingers in parts of Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia. Cesium-137 continues to circulate through forests, soil, and livestock. In some areas, experimental farms operate even inside former exclusion zones. Milk, meat, and honey are produced and sold. Many farmers report seeing no visible health effects and believe the danger has passed. Scientists caution that radiation damage does not announce itself. It operates at the cellular level. Its effects may take years, even decades, to appear. Health statistics tell a clearer story. In Belarus, government data shows that thyroid cancer rates in children rose more than 30-fold after the disaster. Rates among adults also increased. While most thyroid cancers are treatable when caught early, the rise itself reflects the scale of radiation exposure. There are ways to reduce contamination. In parts of Ukraine, farmers use a substance known as Prussian blue, or ferrocin, which binds radioactive cesium in the digestive tract of cattle and reduces the amount that enters milk. But awareness and implementation of such measures varies widely. Some farmers near contaminated zones report never receiving guidance on how to limit radionuclide uptake. Health officials emphasize that risk depends on exposure level, duration, and individual physiology. A single exposure may pose little danger. Repeated exposure increases risk. Radiation does not disappear after one meal. It accumulates. Today, international agencies continue to monitor the long-term health effects of Chernobyl. However, food safety enforcement remains the responsibility of national governments. The World Health Organization does not regulate food exports. It relies on domestic authorities to identify and report problems. As a result, contaminated food can still move through markets without international oversight. Chernobyl transformed milk from a symbol of nourishment into a pathway for invisible exposure. It revealed how deeply nuclear disasters can infiltrate everyday life, not through dramatic scenes, but through ordinary habits. Drinking milk, feeding children, trusting the land. Nearly 4 decades later, milk is no longer dangerous in most regions affected by Chernobyl. But in pockets of lingering contamination, the risks remain. Not because radiation is dramatic, but because it is silent, cumulative, and persistent. Chernobyl did not poison milk once. It changed how the world understands food, radiation, and long-term exposure permanently.